Hello, I'm Nicholas Love, Chief Executive Officer with the Color Group, and certainly I'm delighted to have Celeste Warren joining me today. She was one of the 25 dope thinkers to watch for the year of 2026, and if you don't know, we define a dope thinker as someone who's elevating categories, products, and people through the power of cultural and inclusive intelligence. And this is certainly something that Celeste has hung her hat on. She is arguably one of the GOATs in the arena of talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion. She is a former Global Chief Diversity Officer with Merck. She earned her college degrees from both the University of Kentucky and Carnegie Mellon. She is the author of a variety of books, has made several appearances in Black Enterprise, Savoy, Diversity's Global Magazine, and Diversity's Women's Magazine, right? And she is no stranger to the podcast Hemisphere. I joked earlier, she's been making more public speaking appearances than Michelle Obama these days. But at the end of the day, Celeste is a phenomenal person, a powerful mind, and someone I'm privileged and honored to have the opportunity to call friend. So Celeste, thank you for joining me, and again, congratulations for being named one of the top 25 dope thinkers to watch for 2026.
Thank you, Nicholas, and thank you for the invitation to have this conversation with you. I'm really looking forward to it because you get into the essence of dope thinking and what it's all about. So thank you for this invitation, and I hope I don't disappoint.
Oh no, I have absolutely no doubts that you won't. So let's kind of get in a little bit about you, right? We certainly kind of shared your accolades and talked a little bit about, your educational background, but really at the core, who is Celeste Warren?
Well, at the core, I'm first and foremost a mother, a wife, an advocate. I'm a track mom as well. My daughter's no longer competing anymore. She graduated, but and soccer mom with my son as well. I am someone who wants to lift their voice and use their platform for purpose. And my purpose centers around ensuring that we have diverse influencers, diverse dope thinkers, diverse people throughout this world that feel the strength to elevate their voices through a culture of inclusion, and then also by meeting them where they are and giving them what they need to succeed.
All of those things to me speak, whether it's conscious or subconscious, a clear pathway to establishing legacy, right? Legacy as a mom, legacy as a leader, legacy as a voice creator. What does legacy mean to you?
Oh, legacy for me, I think about my mom and dad. So they both passed away, but my father was the first Black teacher, first Black principal in Western Pennsylvania. And when I think about legacy, I think about his legacy and how it impacted me to act the way that I do, to forge forward in my life. And that's all around that quiet discipline that he had, and then the combination of my mom's fire and energy. She was a quiet but fireful. If you didn't know her very well, you'd think she was this quiet woman from the north side of Pittsburgh. But she, for those that knew her and knew her very well, she was this fiery activist in her own right. And she was our COO of our home, and I would argue CEO of our home. But she was sort of the fire to my dad's earth and dirt, and together I have all of those parts in me. So for me, legacy is, what am I doing to ensure that I'm upholding what they believed in, their principles, their standards, and their purpose, and letting that flow through my life as well. And so I hope the same thing happens for those that I encounter and my children as well, that they look at what I believe in and my purpose and say, that's something that I want to make sure that I carry through in my life as well.
I want to go back to something that you said about your dad, right? You talked about your dad being the first Black teacher, first Black principal.
Yeah.
And there's a degree of discipline being first of anything, particularly when you're the first Black something and you are a Black male.
Yeah.
Right. And one could make, and certainly the same applies to being the first Black female as well. But I want to go back to your dad and talk about the word discipline, right? Because that's certainly something that seems to be foreign important these days, and that's another conversation for another day, right? But watching your father as a child, right, in those roles, and certainly I would imagine that some of the lessons, some of the observations started to make a lot more sense, right, as you grew older and became an adult. But what was kind of that big lesson, that big idea, right, that you observed from your father going through the phases of being the first?
Yeah, he was, he got his master's degree at the University of Pittsburgh, or Westminster College. He went undergraduate at Pittsburgh. But so he has a master's degree. Here's a man that has a master's degree in education, specializing in English. And he is hired his first teaching job as a gym teacher, phys ed teacher. And by the way, they didn't have a gymnasium. So he had to have his classes out in the parking lot. And when he would teach each period, each class, the parents of those students would come and park their cars and watch this black man teaching their children. And he was telling me this story. I'll never forget this. I was in college and I was home, and he was telling me this story. And I was like getting enraged. I'm like, well, who do they think they are? What do they think that you were going to do to them, for God's sake? And he said, he goes, I don't know. And I said, well, what did you do? And I'm expecting, did you go and say, hey, what are you doing here? Go to the cars or whatever? And he said, no. He said, I didn't do any of that. I just did my job. I taught the students. I did what I was supposed to do. I didn't think about the cars that were in the parking lot staring at me, watching me. And you know what happened? And I said, what? What happened? And he said, one by one, as days passed, those cars disappeared until the point where I had established their trust, not just their trust as parents, but the trust of the students and the respect of the students. And that story kind of stuck with me, because it's basically what he did was he did his job. He did it with a level of integrity and respect for himself, and didn't sort of come down to the level of some of those folks that were not trusting him at that moment. And he was himself. He was that disciplined, purposeful man. And eventually the cars disappeared and they came to respect him, to the point where when he passed away, the elementary school in that school district was named after him.
Wow. Wow. How does that type of story kind of shape you and your career trajectory and your approach to human resources at some of the highest levels?
Yeah, it was absolutely a lesson that I learned throughout my life's journey. And it taught me to basically say, okay, do the job the way that it needs to be done, through a lens of inclusion, through a lens of equity, through a lens of making sure that whatever it is that you're creating, policies, practices, procedures, whatever it is, that you're doing it so that everyone can benefit from it, not just a select few. And, in a lot of cases, just like my father, I was the first in certain jobs, and have to walk that tightrope of all eyes being on you and sort of in this fishbowl, and making sure that you are setting a good example for those that are going to come after you. So when you recommend others to come into this job or this position or this project, that they don't look at you and say, well, you act this way, why should we bring in someone else? Now, we all know that the standards are double for us, right? I grew up with my father and my mother telling me, you have to work twice as hard to get half as far. That's ingrained in my head, and that's not going to go away. And so I approached my career with that mindset. I wanted to make sure that I was doing things that were beyond reproach, that no one could say that I didn't do the best effort, didn't put forth the best effort, and that it was done at a level where the bar was high. I had very high standards for myself, and that sort of carried me throughout my career. It caused some doors to open, and to be honest with you, it caused some doors to close too. Unfortunately, for those that maybe might have been a bit threatened by my work ethic. And it wasn't about a competition. It was just that was the standards by which I grew up with, that I saw in my parents, and I carried through.
Yeah, one of the, and I really appreciate that you just shared both sides of the journey, right? Mm-hmm. That your tenacity, that your discipline, discipline, that you're focused, it created some opportunities, and then it also, in certain situations, closed opportunities. Right? And certainly those of you who, may be of religious faith, right? We hear divine order in everything in life, right? And the reality of the situation, and this is certainly something that I've spent a lot of time training, my staff, training those who I've mentored, and even right now, those who I lecture. Said, right, is that when you have a skill set and you are employable, right, there are certain levels of confidence and certain levels of recognition that you must put forth, right? And you must embrace the situations that are for you, just like you embrace the situations that are not, right? Because the worst thing that you can do is operate within this what if mindset, right? If I would have done this, what would have happened? And the reality of the situation is that if you've done the work to put you in a position to be able to be elevated and accelerate in your career journey, your confidence lies there, not in the belief of somebody else, right? And so being okay that you might not be for everybody or everywhere is certainly often a trait or characteristic where you see a direct correlation with high achievers.
Yeah.
I really appreciate you kind of offering that perspective. I would
Nicholas, there's a something that you said is so very profound. It's don't try to assimilate, accelerate. And that's what we need to make sure that young people understand, especially young people of color. Because we, in our generation, we were told by, corporate colleagues, so-called mentors, well, you need to assimilate. You need to act like they act. And, when I first came into corporate America, I said, okay, well, I have to do that too. And I quickly learned that isn't how you can accelerate. You know that you can do the job. You know that you can do the project, the assignment. Do it to the best of your ability, and don't try to mimic other people. You need to be your authentic self, because your authentic self is wonderful, and don't downplay it by trying to be somebody else.
Is that the advice that you would give a 25-year-old version of yourself?
Yeah, I would absolutely, because when I first got into corporate America, I listened to everybody around me, because thinking that, okay, well, they know they've been around, for a while. But I would tell my 25-year-old self that don't try to assimilate, don't try to calibrate and try to be in spaces that weren't designed for you. You'll know, and as a woman of faith, God will put you in those places where you're supposed to be. There's an old gospel song, what God has for you, it has for me, it is for me. And I firmly believe that. And so your voice, 25-year-old Celeste, your voice is your asset. And don't try to assimilate. Just do your best job, accelerate, and don't try to fit into places that weren't designed for you in the first place.
The doors of the church are now open. Oh man, that was a word. And as they say in the streets these days, that was definitely a bar. In your book, you talk about the frequent confusion around the term equality, right? And that equality is often thought of in this way of treating everyone fairly. But equality and fairness are two different terms. Can you explain?
Yeah. So equality is basically, it's a state where we're all trying to get to, but we're not there yet. We're far from there. And equality is you would give everybody the same thing, regardless of their identity, their skills or capabilities, their competencies, their life experiences, where they started. And we all know that we didn't all start in the same place. We didn't all start in the same schools, the same neighborhoods, the same areas of the world. And so that's where equality sort of fails, when you don't take into account the fact that people started from different places. And so that's why equitable and fair practices are really, really important. And I don't use and interchange the words equity, equitable, and fair, because equity is where you meet people where they are and you give them what they need to be able to succeed and to reach whatever aspirations that they have. You take into account that they didn't start at the same place. So you're able to provide them with those things that will prevent, get those obstacles and those barriers out of the way that are more natural for certain marginalized groups than they are for others. And then fairness, my father used to say, a fair is a place where you go and eat funnel cake and watch pigs. Because what's fair to one individual may not be fair to another individual. And so you have to use the phrases together, equitable and fair practices. Because if you use just fair, and those of us that have kids or siblings, we know that we want something and mom may have given it to sis and didn't give it to us, but there was a reason why it was given to sis and not to us that mom knows, because she's looking at it from a different lens. But to me, it's not fair because I didn't get it, and sis got it. So fair is in the eye of the beholder. But when you say fair and equitable practices, you are meeting people where they are. You understand that they didn't start in the same places, and so you have to understand the places where they did start. What are some of those obstacles and barriers that are in the way, and then try and help them blow those away.
So the reason why I asked that question, particularly following the advice question, right? Because what you just explained has been fundamental to me in my career journey, how I've navigated and managed and led, right, at a variety of places. Because I can remember, and there's a, whether it's fair or not, right, there's a perception that the younger you are, you're going to make emotional based decisions in the workplace when things are not necessarily moving at the pace or moving at the speed, right, in which you need to. And I've certainly experienced that. And so as a leader, right, when I'm leading directors or VPs or managers, there are particular questions that I'm asking and probing, right, to understand, are you leading with both equity and a recognition of the individual, right, and being centered in that approach? Are there biases that are showing up, right, because you believe certain people should be at a certain level, but you didn't do the homework to understand where they were, right?
Yeah.
Because oftentimes in the corporate setting, people are named to these senior level positions, but they're not developed as leaders, right? There's a difference between leadership and managing, right?
Yeah.
And oftentimes the difference between the two can have a direct correlation on retention and departures, right? For those who are managing younger staff members, right? So I really appreciate you kind of breaking down equity, fairness, right? Identifying that there's a difference between the two, giving someone or giving our listeners, if you will, a framework in terms of understanding that you have to meet people where they're at, and to meet people where they're at, you have to ask the right questions. Far too often in life, we're providing the right solution to the wrong question.
You got it. Preach, Nicholas.
I'm on my Freddie Haynes remix, right? So no, I mean, like, I really appreciate that perspective. That's someone who's lived it, in a place where it was having an emotional impact on me. My direct experience in being managed by someone who did not approach things with equity, with an inclusive mindset, right? That I vowed that any area that I'm responsible will approach things with an equitable, with an inclusive mindset to ensure that no one feels the same way that I feel. I really appreciate that. I want to, kind of start to pivot and really focus in on leadership. Right? You spent a lot of time, leading units, right? Who have, quite frankly, a key contributor to the culture of that respective organization. Let's start with this first question, because there's a lot of myths about leadership. What's the biggest myth about leadership that you would like to see disappear?
One of the myths that I would like to see disappear is that leaders are supposed to know everything about everything. And that is a huge, huge myth. And there's certain things that you know as you're coming along in your career and in your discipline. But as a leader, it's sort of, it's like a pyramid, right? There's a reason that organizational structures, most of them are like a pyramid, where the higher you get up, the fewer roles there are. And when you think of an iceberg, a leader is if they're at the tip of that iceberg, they only know a certain amount, and you're relying on your teams and the people in your organization to understand and know what it is that they know. And what you're supposed to do is provide a vision, a direction, where's Z, where do we ultimately need to be? And then each of the people in your organization, through their independent disciplines and roles within the organization, know what it is that they need to do to get to that point, what it is that they specialize in that's going to help to get to that point. It's sort of like I hate using sports analogies, but it's sort of like a basketball team, right? You have 5 players on the team at the same time. You have a coach, you have a trainer, and the forwards, the guards, the center, they have a role to play. But ultimately, the goal is to win the game, right? The coach is playing a role, the trainer is playing a role, the statisticians are playing a role, and everybody's role is different, but the outcome is to win the game. And so that coach, as a leader, is coaching each of them in their specific role and saying, okay, we want, as a team, this is our goal. And the forward, the guard, the center, they know what it is that they've got to do in order to make sure that they win the game. And it's the same thing in organizations. The leader is supposed to be there to lead the team up the hill and make sure that everyone has what they need. Again, there's that trust and that understanding and that equity, what they need to be able to perform, making sure that they have it, blowing out those obstacles and barriers that are getting in the way so they can all get to the goal that the organization has. And that's the leader's role, to share that vision, make sure people understand that vision, they understand where Z is, and then rely on their teams who know the underbelly of the organization to operate in a way that gets them to that vision.
Yeah, you've heard me, in past conversations talk, about one of my mentors, Adrienne Nazar. And one of the things that she instilled in me very early, our meeting of each other, is that there's going to be a position where you're doing the work. Then there's a level where you're influencing the work. Mm-hmm. And then there's a level where you set the vision that influences the work that's actually being executed, right?
Yeah.
And your ability to have awareness at all 3 levels and understanding all 3 levels and what's needed to ensure that alignment and precision is in place, right, is going to have a direct correlation on how successful your vision is actually executed, right? Mm-hmm. So 1,000% agree with everything that you just said. I want to, you certainly, we spent some time talking about your father. I want to, drill deep into the leadership component. The example that you did earlier was phenomenal. Would love to kind of understand from you what defining moment for you has really kind of shaped your leadership philosophy.
Oh gosh, I think for me it was when I first became a vice president, and there was a bunch of, few folks that had been at those ranks for a long time and were giving me advice about how you act, how you dress, where you park your car. I mean, all of this superficial stuff. And in my first few, months in at that level, I was, you're listening, you sort of like, you peek your head up and you're looking around like, oh, okay, I've reached this level and I'm supposed to be a certain way. And I quickly learned that I need to be me. I need to be Celeste Warren and not who people think I should be or who they think I am or how I should act. And, going back to that lesson of back in when I was 25, it all came to the forefront again because, I was like, oh, I'm a vice president now. I have to do this or I have to act this way. And I was like, it took me a short while to say, that's not you. People know you. They know who you are. And things shouldn't change because you've reached a certain level. You've reached that level because of what you've been able to deliver, because of what you've been able to do. And the respect that people have from you. Don't lose that respect because you then flip to being somebody who you think you're supposed to be. And that was a big lesson for me, very big lesson for me. And once I learned that lesson, then I was able to truly be the leader that I think my parents would have been proud of.
Well, I'm pretty confident that they would be. Very, very confident. When you talk about giving that advice to your 25-year-old self, and you talk about, kind of the switch coming on at the P level, looking back, what's one leadership skill that you most underestimate is important to how you approach them?
Listening, empathetic listening. You cannot, as a leader, you cannot listen enough. If you're doing too much of this and not enough of this, then you're going to have problems. And like I said, as a leader, you're not supposed to know everything. You're supposed to understand the strategy, set that strategy and that vision. But you need to be able to listen to people as you're developing that vision, as you're developing that strategy, and so you can understand, well, that's not going to work, or that'll work, or that won't play very well with this group of people or this community of customers. You have to make sure that you can listen, and listen empathetically, not listening from the standpoint of, you know, those people that they're not really listening. They're listening to they're thinking about what they're going to say next to counteract what you're saying. And what I mean is empathetic listening. You're listening with empathy because you truly want to connect with the individual. You truly want to learn from them because it's going to help you to create a better strategy, connect better with your customers and clients, and connect better, frankly, with all of your employees that you're responsible for. So to me, it's listening.
Well, there's a certain gentleman who occupies what historically has been perceived and received as the most powerful position in the world. That for decades, people have been talking about the competitive advantage that diversity, equity, and inclusion provides for companies, for organizations, for the world. Quite frankly. But since a certain presidential election ended 2 years ago, and since a certain inauguration happened last year, right, diversity, equity, and inclusion has been, if not priority number one, priority 1A, right? Attacking, despite the decades of empirical data, despite the decades of conversation that are worth listening to. From your perspective, why is diversity so important, and why do you believe it's been under attack?
Yeah, so diversity, you can't stop diversity. Diversity is simply differences in people. Differences you can see and differences you can't. So the outward appearance, the inward perspectives, and all of those different differences that are embodied in an individual. And people think that they can just stop it, and you can't, because first of all, when you think globally, and this is like one of those moments that some people don't realize, when you think globally, individuals globally, people of color are the majority. Asian, African, Latin America. So differences are already abundant, highly abundant around the world. So from a demographic standpoint, you can't stop the evolution of the differences of people, especially when we see the intersection of cultures that's happening and has been happening. The reason why I feel that it's getting such backlash, number one, simply is because of the fear, and the fear of those that are in power losing that power, which is eventually going to happen, again, because of the demographics. Secondly, what we're trying to do is beyond performative, but with diversity, equity, and inclusion, you have to change systems. You have to embed it and integrate it into systems and change structurally how things have been in for probably centuries. So that's a fear for those that are in power. And then the third thing that really just gives me those white knuckle moments where I have to sort of say, okay, calm yourself, is the basic bias that people who are different perspectives, different identities, they believe that they are inferior. They are not intelligent. They cannot cannot take certain roles. They cannot be in certain places and in certain positions simply because of the color of their skin, their gender, their sexual orientation, their religious belief, etc. And that bias is so ridiculous that it is it's something that is, it's the foundation is just fear. It's simply fear and unintelligence. And so, helping people to understand that skills, capabilities, intelligence, ambition, work ethic, all of those things can be embodied in people who look different across a myriad of different dimensions of diversity. And that's what people need to understand. That is something that is a basic flaw in thinking of these folks that have this anti-DE&I rhetoric.
Diversity without inclusion is what?
It's just differences in people. If you don't create a culture of belonging, of inclusion, that people feel valued so they can produce, so they can be productive, you'll never get them to a collective purpose. And in an organization, a collective purpose is the vision and the mission of that organization. So you got all these people with all of these differences in skills, capabilities, cultural experiences, life experiences, barriers that get in their way, obstacles that get in their way, all of these different people, all of these different differences that are in an organization, and you're trying to get them to drive the company performance, the mission, the vision. You're trying to get them to this collective purpose. If you want all of those people with all of those differences to get to that collective purpose, you have to surround them with a culture of inclusion, a culture of belonging, a culture of engagement, where they feel that they can contribute regardless of who they are and how they identify. If you can't do that, that's leadership 101. That's why I laugh when people talk about diversity, equity, inclusion. It's leadership 101, it's management 101, and it's business 101. Because if you don't understand, as a business leader, and you're putting together a marketing strategy and a sales strategy, you don't understand your customers, you don't understand the diversity in your customers, you don't understand and segment your customer base, that's marketing 101. So how are you going to sell your product or your service if you don't understand why certain segments of your market don't want your product? It makes no sense. And so that's why I laugh when people, oh, DEI. It's like, you have no idea that it is here, it is not going anywhere, and your ignorance of not understanding the essence of what it is, the foundational element of what it is it just plays on you every time you say something like that.
Let me get real for a second, right? So in Shane Dyer's book entitled Dismantling Global White Privilege, the book argues that representation alone does not dismantle global white privilege. It often simply diversifies with an existing power structure.
Yep.
From the seats that you've occupied, how do you assess whether an organization is redistributing power versus diversifying optics?
Yeah, you can't just change people without changing the system that the people are in. Because if we don't change the systems, it doesn't make a difference what the people in power look like. The system will be such that they will have a sense of privilege. And so we have to really focus on the systems. We have to look at who gets the opportunities, who gets the access, and why, and then really look at the policies, the practices, the procedures, and really say, okay, how do we change those and sort of rebuild them with inclusion in the beginning? How do we build policies, practices, procedures, and systems which take into account at the very concept of them, when they're building the strategy out, that we want this to be inclusive. We want this to be able to benefit everybody, or as many people as we can, who want this service or this product or this, whatever it may be, whatever the category is. We have to start from the inside and out. And a lot of times we look at diversity and inclusion simply from a butts and seats representation, and not structurally and systemically, and say, okay, how do we make sure that we are creating systems that move with the people and don't cause them to be stagnant where they are? And that's education systems, that's societal institutions, and that's organizations, whether it be Fortune 1000, nonprofits. It doesn't make a difference. But we've got to look at the systems and change them, because we can't just change the people. That's so unfair to think that a person is going to step in a role and be able to change hundreds and hundreds of years. It doesn't work like that. You have to attack the system, and and that's kind of where I think we've fallen short a little bit, those of us that have been trying to do this, and that's what back in the 60s, when we think about the civil rights movement, that's what they were trying to do. They were trying to change and create laws and looking at the infrastructure to try to change it. And we need to keep thinking about that. How do we do that? And not just trying to put people in certain roles. That's important, putting people in certain roles. But if you just do that without changing the system, then it's not going to work, because when the person changes out, which inevitably happens, you still have the same system in place.
Yeah, there's a fundamental difference between noise and movement.
Yes.
The noise can be defined as, we have someone at a VP level, we have someone at a board level. But if that person has no equity, has no decision-making power, has no ability, and if people aren't being held accountable for allowing this individual to have a presence, it's just noise. It's not moving. It's not moving. With that being said, what practical steps can organizations take to decenter dominant cultural norms and leadership activities?
Well, first
or pipelines, actually.
Yeah. Well, first you have to assess. You have to really look at, okay, what do we need to do, and do a self-assessment, looking at, again, your policies, your practices, your procedures, who's in the power structures, and not just at the top levels of the organization, but also within the organization, your social networks. Who are those people who are influencers within the organization? But you have to do an assessment, and then you have to say, okay, well, where do we want to be? Where do we need to be? Sort of that future state or that desired state. And then once you determine that, and you have to take time to determine that too, because a lot of times people don't do that. They do the assessment and then start changing without knowing where Z is, right? They're at A and they need to get to Z. And once you do that, then you start putting and changing and restructuring the different things that are in place, or creating new things to get you from point A to point Z. That's the simple way of looking at it from a very pragmatic standpoint. It's not easy by any means, because there are going to be those points of tension, those points of resistance, those points of friction that normally come whenever you're trying to do organizational change. But with the right leadership team, with the right people in place, with the right strategy, and with the right systems integration and changes, you can do what you need to do. And but it's not going to happen overnight, and you have to have patience and resilience.
Earlier on, I talked about the importance of asking the right question to get to the right solution. So I'm going to put you on the spot now.
Okay.
If I can. If you're talking to someone that's under 30, right, who is entering into the workforce, trying to ensure that they're making the best possible decision for themselves, right? Mm-hmm. And inclusive atmospheres is at the top of their priority list. What are three questions that you can arm them with to start to kind of unpack a little bit around the maturity level of that organization from an inclusive leadership?
Well, I would ask them, number one, they don't even have to ask this question, because they can look at their website and see what their board of directors looks like, the representation there, the representation of their leadership. So that's a start. But then a couple of questions I think I would ask would be, tell me about your talent development practices. What do they look like? How are they inclusive? Do they exclude others? And how does one understand what those talent practices and policies and procedures are? The second thing I would add, because if it's not transparent, then you can't understand how you're going to develop in an organization, and how you can maneuver your career as well, if it's not transparent. I think the second question I would ask is, if it truly is an organization that its foundational element is around inclusive workforces and inclusive environments in society. One of the things I would ask about is their philanthropic efforts. Where do you put and focus on from a societal standpoint and making society a better place? Where do you put your money? What organizations do you contribute to? That tells a lot too about an organization's true value. So those are a couple of things I would look from an internal lens and an external lens.
Very nice, very nice. So one thing that we see at the Color Group is dope thinkers recognize other dope thinkers. Would love to hear from you. Who's a dope thinker that you know that many may not know? And what makes them a dope thinker?
Well, I don't know this person, but I'm familiar with them. James Baldwin comes to mind. He was a writer, a cultural critic, intellectual, and what I liked about him is he could take what was happening in America and diagnose it like with a scalpel. He could look at the racial inequities, and that's kind of where he focused at, the inequities that existed, and sort of contrast that with the moral contradictions of America. And the way that he approached it, it was like a surgeon. He did it with intelligence. He always held himself with dignity and respect. And it is somebody who I wasn't as familiar with earlier on in my career, but later parts of my career where I started seeing him pop up and quotes of his pop up, and in his books, I was like, this man, he was a surgeon. He truly held the mirror up on America, and he did it from the standpoint of he understood the culture, he understood our history, and he also had an understanding of what needed to happen, and that whole thing around the structural change that needed to happen.
Dope thinkers recognize dope thinkers, ladies and gentlemen. Intelligence, grit, disruptor, authentic, pragmatic, consistent, focused, and visionary. All characteristics and traits that describe Celeste Warren. Thank you so much for joining me today. It's been a pleasure as always. And again, congratulations on being one of the 25 dope thinkers to watch for 2026.
Thank you, Nicholas. Thank you for the designation and the recognition. And keep on doing what you're doing too, because it is so needed, especially in today's world.
Thank you.